Now, one of the things that I want to really get across is the depth of spirituality at some of the churches where the clubs were founded, because that spirit lived on. Now, I'll give you one example. In the case of Manchester City, their first president was the Reverend Arthur Connell, and he served for 30 years at that church, and they included the time when St. Mark's Football Club was founded, from which Manchester City emerged. And when he developed a chronic bronchitis condition and the paralysis of his vocal cord, he felt he had to resign. But the impact he had made was such that people begged him to stay on, even though he no longer had any voice. And they said, "A man teaches by what he is." And the sight of Mr. Connell walking through the streets would have reminded the people that his life and example was one they could follow. Now, he made an incredible impact. And what was the basis of his faith? In his farewell address, which had to be read out because he couldn't speak, he said, "I trust my preaching has been of no uncertain sound. Christ and him crucified was the theme on which I delighted to dwell, knowing there was no subject more saving in its power." Now, that was the spiritual climate in the church at the time the club was founded. And it's that sort of teaching that the early Manchester City players would have been familiar with. Fulham, it was a very deprived area at the time, and they opened a mission. This is St. Andrew's Church, Fulham, opened a mission. And when they were joined by a new curate who was renowned as one of the country's top oarsmen, that curate, called Peregrine Propert, they had great names in those days.
That's quite a name.
Peregrine Propert. He took charge of the mission building, and there was a gymnasium there. And he, with his fame as one of the country's top oarsmen, quickly attracted the youngsters from the early football club to him as a fellow sportsman. He was also a good cricketer. And then this is the climate in which he was operating. Now, I need to mention that the people who attended this mission were rough and ready and seen to be hooligan elements, dirty, smelly, bad language, and they worked mostly in the cab yards, cleaning the coaches of the nobility and so on, the carriages. And this is the climate in which Propert was operating, and he wrote this: "Among them I worked and made some of my best friends, some of whom remain so to this day. On Saturday nights we had very simple sing-songs, and some came to our services on Sundays. We had a gymnasium, and boxing became very popular. In this I took a very prominent part, and from this little place we turned out a national as well as international champion. At this time I was rowing for the Thames Rowing Club First 8, and when I brought home silver trophies and cups, it produced great excitement and admiration. My association with these fellows, whose language was not always classical, produced much criticism from the respectable, some of whom went so far as to say I was not fit to be a clergyman, and reported me to the Bishop, Dr. Temple. I explained to Dr. Temple that I'd come not merely to preach, but to apply Christian principles as far as I could. I believe I convinced the good bishop that my critics did not really understand the gospel message. I came not to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance. I think even now the church has largely forgotten this truth. We are truly respectable. Now, Propert and the climate of the St. Andrew's Church was based on a real gospel ministry. And it meant that the players who were the first members of what became Fulham Football Club, they were known initially as St. Andrew's Football Club, they would have heard things such as that. A terrific depth of the gospel message. It wasn't just nominal. And Propert stayed at that church for many, many years. But the mistake he made was, and this is something to do with Victorian society, the mistake he made was not the fact that he ministered to these rough and ready lads, but he became friends with them. Right. Because Victorian times, vicars, ministers, clergymen were regarded as a higher class. And consequently, to make friends with people in a class beneath you is a sellout, and you were frowned upon for doing that. So it shows you unconditional love at work.
And that must have been really heartening for those lads, mustn't it? You know, to have this gentleman bucking societal norms in order
to... Absolutely. You know, he was involved with them, he took part, he played cricket with them, but he actually formed friendships, and that was unheard of. And the same thing happened at Tottenham, you know, Graham. The club was basically formed by John Ripshire, who was the Bible class teacher, and those lads were really keen to get started. But when they marked out their pitches on the Tottenham marshes, some of the hooligans, local hooligans, would kick them off and take over the pitch. Or, if they weren't kicked off, the yobs would stand alongside and hurl abuse at them. Anyway, some of them were so disheartened, they left. But the others went to their Bible class teacher, John Ripshire, and said, "Can you help us? They won't let us play." And so Ripshire did. He sorted that out and made sure they could play. But even more than that, he said, "Look, you need to be a properly organised outfit with a committee and regular fixtures and so on." And so they asked him if he would be the president and do this, and he did. Now, here's this thing about the social class difference. The boys were not of his social class, and they were also very badly behaved. And they were allowed, through Ripshire's influence, to use the local YMCA building as their headquarters, not just for meetings, but they could change there, and they could also play in the basement in the winter to practice. Now, these lads disobeyed all the rules of the YMCA. They did things like playing cards, they pinched berries from the mulberry bushes, and above all, they were very noisy down in the basement. And on one occasion, there was a meeting of the YMCA committee on the floor above, and the racket the boys were making was so bad that one of them came down angrily to sort them out. And just as he opened the door, the ball hit him smack in the face, and it had just been in the chimney, so he was covered with soot. And he said, "That's it, they've got to go." And the committee said, "They've got to go." Now, at that time, Graham, as I just showed you, if you showed any association with people, either on a friendship basis, or you continued to be friendly with them when they'd embarrassed you, it would have been seen as weakness. And Ripshire, instead of letting them go, asked the vicar if they could have another building owned by the church as their base. And, well, as you can imagine, the vicar was a bit concerned, knowing their reputation, and said, "Okay, on condition they attend a service every Wednesday evening." And so they did that, and then eventually they were caught playing cards in the pews at the back, and the vicar expelled them. Now, this is twice that these lads have been expelled, and twice Ripsher wouldn't give up on them. And you can imagine what people were saying at the time. He's giving these hooligans another chance. Children, youngsters are meant to be seen, not heard, and we have very strict rules in our society about behaviour, and they don't honour them. He has no right to stay with them. Now, again, do you remember a few moments ago I said that Peregrine Propert said he'd come to call sinners to repentance? Well, this is underlying the same idea here, because he was unconditionally accepting these boys and remaining an influence in their lives. And then he got them another headquarters, and basically that's how the club survived. And it's amazing that this unconditional love so influenced the boys that when the club when it went professional, 2 of those lads were members of the committee, or several of them were members of the committee, and then when they became a limited company, 2 of them were directors. And it turned out that the qualities of character and Christian behaviour that Ripsher had instilled in them influenced the way they ran Tottenham Hotspur when they were in positions of influence in the club. And that's why Tottenham Hotspur was known as the most popular club in England right up to about 1950, because of the spirit that Ripsher had imbued continued. And it was said that if any of their players crossed the line of fair play, they were immediately thrown out of the club. So you can see why Ripsher was why he so impressed the modern day Tottenham people, who said, this man deserves a headstone and we're going to give him one.
And it's such a wonderful demonstration of the power of faith.
Yes.
And the qualities that you can imbue. And it's also, I think, quite a good intersection between the power of both faith and the game. You know,
yes.
The power it has for bringing people together, but also instilling a discipline and respect within people. And
yes,
obviously,
definitely. And I think basically I can sum up, shall we say, the spiritual substance of many of these clubs in the words of the first president of Southampton Football Club, Basil Wilberforce, who was the rector of St Mary's Church. Now, St Mary's Church was the church in Southampton. It was where all the big civic events happened, like the induction of the mayor, and it was the place to be seen. So a lot of people went there just to let others know, oh, look, here I am. Wilberforce found this repugnant, and he wrote this in the parish magazine, and I think it sums up what all the others would have agreed to. And he said this: personal fellowship with Christ is the secret of quietness and peace. In like manner, it is the source of heart rest in the difficulties of life. To be a Christian is not to profess a faith or to conform to a creed. It is the acknowledgement of a close connection between Christ and the soul. It is not the imitation of a perfect model, but the indwelling of a spiritual power. And I think that really sums it up. When the Manchester City first president said there is nothing more saving in its power than the gospel message, and when this man says it's a relationship with Christ, then this is what I think was the depth of Christian engagement of the churches with the youngsters at the time. This is the sort of message they would be hearing. And we've lost all of that today, haven't we?
Yeah, obviously it's a very different landscape today. I think, obviously, I mean, all clubs are growing exponentially in terms of the amount of money involved in the game. And, I could point to St Mark's West Gorton to Manchester City as being, perhaps one of the starker examples. But where do you think God's Place lands in the modern game?
That's a very interesting question, because we've noticed, haven't we, how so many players are lifting up their shirts at the end of the match and say, I belong to Jesus. We know that Kaka did this to start with, and then Alisson Becker at Liverpool has done the same thing. There are several Christian players now who openly acknowledge their faith, and they're not getting laughed at. But one of the things I think is most important is that most clubs now have a chaplain. And these chaplains do the following things. I've got this quote from their website. It says that they provide ongoing pastoral and spiritual care to those of faith or no faith for the well-being of all involved in the community of sport. Now, I have some friends who are chaplains to some of these clubs, and the things they do, clearly they are there to help players who are going through traumas of one sort or another, because you might be rich and famous, but it doesn't stop your wife getting cancer or a family member being killed in a car crash. Disasters like this, but also nice things like wanting to be married and asking the chaplain if he would do that or she would do that. And there are 4 areas that I think you'll find interesting. Well, first of all, a chaplain regularly visits the training grounds and the stadium. And by visiting the stadium, it means that the chaplain is there for people who work for the club in any way. People who make the teas, people who sweep, keep everything clean, and also the managing director or the CEO or the whatever. Anybody who is involved in the actual stadium, they're there for. They also conduct, as I mentioned, weddings, funerals, scattering of ashes on the pitch, and very popular are carol services at Christmas time. They also get involved in club community programs, which cover a whole range of social issues such as health and antisocial behavior, drugs, crime, disability. They help out in all sorts of initiatives like that. And one club, Bolton, actually has a special pre-match event at the stadium for supporters called Family, Faith and Football. And they get speakers in from the club and elsewhere who share their faith in the context of football and show how football can be a family in its own right, and families are welcome to attend these events. So there is, through the very powerful support given by chaplains, a very real awareness that faith can still play a vital part in a club today.
Yeah, I think also, as time goes on, I'm sensing a bit of a cultural shift, because I think a lot of people are starting to really try and grasp for meaning and a purpose in life now. And as because the world's changing very quickly, do you have any sort of hope or feelings about that sort of side of things and the impact it might have on faith in the game as well?
That's a very good question, because it encompasses really the whole of society and the way in which the world is moving. I think people are getting more frightened because the world is so unstable at the moment, and we don't know what's going to happen next. And I think that the more people have realized that the chase after fame and glory and money and all the rest of it is empty, and you've got this underlying insecurity and fear, then people start looking for something that's much deeper and much more wholesome than the chase after false attempts to get security. And I've been reading a lot lately that there is a growing interest in the Christian faith, particularly among younger people who are obviously not impressed by the world around them and the society in which they live, and they're looking for something more substantial, more real, more enduring. And I think that this also will impact not just society as a whole, as more people embrace spiritual values, but also within clubs themselves, where, as part of the wider society, people are subject to the same stresses and pressures as everybody else, and the support given by some of their chaplains and some of the players who are openly glad to talk about their faith. I think this could well and truly affect the way in which the game is played. Now, I can give you one example. A friend of mine, I won't say who he is, but a friend of mine, a former professional footballer, talked about the fact that there was a Christian player that everybody knew was a Christian, and people tried deliberately to get him to swear, right, by fouling him, by being aggressive towards him, and so on. And he stood out as being an example to others. And in spite of all these provocations, his Christian faith stood the test. And he was actually respected and admired. Now, with more Christians in the game openly like that particular player, I think that they will bring an influence, they will bring light into darkness in the ways in which God has called them. They're placed in the clubs they're in for a purpose. And obviously that purpose is to be as good a footballer as possible and to honour their contracts and their duties as a player. But also, I think that the spirit in which they play and do things could be a beacon of light in places where there's darkness.
Absolutely. I think, if you forgive me for being a bit personal, but yeah, certainly in my own faith journey, I had this sort of overriding belief in God, but I was always, I kind of kept it behind closed doors because I allowed the outside society to make me feel not ashamed, but uneasy about sharing it. And obviously, you're already aware of this, but for the benefit of the listener, I found your book such an important tool in terms of the manner in which it kind of gave me an in to my faith, and to see all these clubs that were actually formed as church teams, and to see players on the television who are putting it front and centre in their interviews. It's the first answer. It's not buried at the back, like, oh, thanks God, at the back. It's front and centre and above. And so obviously I want to thank you for your wonderful book in inspiring me to finally, explore my faith journey, but also just to share my excitement with the fact that, football players are now putting it front and centre, and I think that's a wonderful thing.
Well, I'm delighted to hear that it had this effect on you, Graham, but really it's not my book as such that's done it for you. It's the fact that the people the book is about are still speaking to us, right, through the way in which they ran their clubs, the way in which they, some of the quotes I've given you, for example. I think their light is shining, and all I've done is to, if you like, put their light into verbal form, in the form of a book, so that what they stood for, what they said, could still be heard today.
Yeah, I think that's beautifully put. If you wouldn't mind me just cycling back very quickly, when you were writing the book, what keeps you going for 7 years or so when you're writing these things? because I wrote an article and it took me about a year and various, sort of crisis.
You know, you hit the nail on the head.
There we go.
It's not.
Okay.
It's not easy. Well, first and foremost, I had an interest in football history anyway, so I did a lot of reading about the Victorian era when these so many clubs were formed. But really, what motivated me so much was the fact that these boys in our league were getting ridiculed for having faith and for going to church. And as I said, when I made this connection about Everton, it made me want to find out more about other clubs, because I wanted to tell these lads and the wider public that there is no contradiction between football and faith. The two can weld together very, very comfortably. So what I really wanted was to get not second-hand reports from other people's books. I wanted to try and get back to the sources themselves. I wanted to hear what these people themselves said. Now, that's where it becomes difficult, because where do you find all this? It's not in match programs. It's not in club magazines. And as I said, I would have to plough through hundreds of newspapers in different parts of the country, in different archives, where reports of church activities were easily found. And you could get from those some of the comments made by some of the people at the time. And again, as I said, parish magazines. Southampton, for example, was very, very proud of its youth activities, and they reported on match progress and everything, accomplishments of the football club. And I wanted to know why. Did they say anything? Well, I got the quote from the vicar of St Andrews in Fulham, who said that he believes in recreation and good fellowship. So it's important that he, in modern terms, was all about fun and friendship, and not about fame and glory. And I was able to find lots and lots of things said by these people, and what others at the time were saying about them, that this made me want to get everything I could, because it was actually building me up. It was edifying me. I was obviously doing it originally to encourage others, but gosh, it was so exciting to find these things out, that I, as a Christian who loves football, could see that there were people of substance and quality who also loved football, but were doing something about it in terms of transmitting the best values and the gospel message to the people in their environment. So it's a bit like a treasure hunt, I would say. That there's so much treasure out there, and you want to find it, and you don't give up. And understandably, it took me a lot of time, a lot of money, because I'd have to travel to all these different towns, and a lot of frustration, because sometimes you could spend a whole day in a well-known library in London and go away with nothing. But you're always looking for that little nugget. And when you find it, you think, right, I've got to keep going. I've got to keep going. Really, I could see something crystallizing. And I really feel that the Lord pointed me towards certain people who were well-positioned to tell me more and point me to sources that I didn't think of. And it all came together. Eventually, I wouldn't say it came together easily, but it came together because of the opportunities that opened up for me, the doors that opened up for me. with people, pointing towards things. I'll just give you one example.
Mm-hmm.
I took photographs everywhere I went to sort of keep the atmosphere of the place in my mind while I was writing. And I was on the Queen's Park estate, and I was taking a picture of the house in which one of the founders of Queen's Park Rangers, one of the early players, lived. And this lady came out quite, not angrily, but certainly very concerned. She said, "Why are you taking pictures of this house?" And I explained, well, one of the first players from Queen's Park Rangers lived here. And she said, oh, right. Listen, you must come and meet Betty,
Mm-hmm.
who lived next door but two. They're Queen's Park Rangers supporters, and she would be really pleased to meet you. So I went to Betty, and they opened up the house. I had lovely coffee and biscuits with them, and then found out that the St. Jude's Institute, which was the mission formed by the parish church, was where they had been with which they'd been involved since very young. And it was there, for example, during the war that they were taught how to put on gas masks and things. And I found out that it was referred to as the Queen's Park Rangers Church. And from that point, I was able to realize that this mission building was exactly what I needed to research, because that's where all the facts were. So a little moment like that, invitation for a coffee and a chat, pointed me to the very building that I needed to find.
That's it. It's the power of sort of saying yes and putting yourself out there, and not being too afraid to experience frustrations and failures, which is I think a pretty good summarization of faith as well, isn't it? You derive your stability and your hope in God, and then everything around that, you work hard obviously, but everything around that, all these earthly activities, you don't focus on them, and if you put your focus in God, then things just happen, don't they?
Absolutely. And as you said, it's when you get the setbacks, when you spend hours and you have to stay in bed and breakfast places and you come away with nothing, it's disheartening. And also, you don't know if anybody's ever going to publish the book, even when it's finished. So there's always this element of uncertainty. But if God puts something on your heart and you feel on fire with something, then you're given the divine energy to keep going, and also doors open for you. And the end result was it came out, and then eventually the stories were filmed and they went out on Christian TV channels across the world. And none of this would have happened if the devil hadn't tried to demoralize the boys in my little football league.
Yeah.
This was God's answer to that taunting. You're all soft, it doesn't mean anything, Bibles are shin pads. And the Lord said, oh no, we're going to tell these lads they're rather special and they're in a special tradition.
Yeah, which is absolutely wonderful. I wouldn't, if possible, and I appreciate a lot of aspects of faith can be somewhat personal, but just wanted to touch on that, if possible, a bit about your journey in your faith. Were you raised in a Christian household, or did you find God later on in life?
Well, I was raised a Catholic, and I I was baptized a Catholic, confirmed a Catholic, and when I went to university, I attended the Catholic chaplaincy for Mass. But something very drastic and tragic happened in my life. I'd been abroad for a year as part of my degree, teaching in Austria. And while I was away, I needed cash. And I contacted a friend of mine at Bangor, my best friend, and said, look, you owe me this amount. Could you possibly send it to me? Well, he never did, in spite of my earnest requests. And my initially disappointment turned to anger, anger turned to resentment, and resentment turned to hate. And I was consumed with this hate for him. Anyway, when the year finished, I went back to Bangor to do the final year of the degree, and I thought, I'll sort this out with my friend. I'll pick the right moment when term starts. And anyway, when term started, I didn't get the chance to have it out with him because he was killed in a motorbike accident. Mm-hmm. And the impact on me was horrific, mm-hmm. because I realized how ugly hatred is.
Yeah.
I hadn't been able to reconcile with him. I felt dirty, and it was as if God was shining a light on me, showing me it's not just your hatred, Peter. There's a lot else, you know. And so I was a wreck, guilt-ridden, and did not know what to do. And then eventually, by this time I'd met Evelyn, and we were going for a walk down by Bangor Pier, where a group of students from the Christian Union were effectively giving the gospel message. Now, I don't remember exactly what was said, but there were 3 words that stuck with me, challenged me. Peace with God. I knew I didn't have it, and I knew I desperately needed it. And so I went to see the chaplain, and he said, well, if you confess and come to communion every day, it will ease. Well, it didn't, in spite of me doing that. And so I started going to the Christian Union and met people there who were clearly God's people. They were radiant, they were full of joy, they were enthusiastic. They had this peace that I didn't have. And I learned from them that God accepts us unconditionally because the sin that we're aware of, and by this time I was calling it sin, everything wrong within me, had been crucified with Jesus on the cross. We were included in his death. And we were also included in his resurrection. So our sinful nature was crucified with him, and in place of that, we were given his nature through the Holy Spirit. And that's what's meant here by Canon Basil Wilberforce at St Mary's Church, Southampton, saying that being a Christian is the acknowledgement of a close connection between Christ and the soul. It's the indwelling of a spiritual power. And that spiritual power we receive is the power of the resurrection, because we've been resurrected from our own, if you like, the death that sin was wreaking within us. And that for me then was the start. It didn't happen immediately, but because I felt so guilty and so sinful that I just couldn't believe this was for me. But these friends in the Christian Union all had similar stories, that they were conscious of having been riddled with sin of one sort or another, and that the answer was the crucifixion of Jesus. Our sin, and we as individual sinners, that side of us was crucified with him, and we were set free from it and can live in the power of the indwelling Holy Spirit. So that briefly, I'm never brief actually, I'm sorry about that.
No, not at all, not at all. It's interesting because I'm assuming it's had a major impact on your life and how you've gone about life, and it's wonderful.
Absolutely.
It's wonderful to
Absolutely.
hear about a sort of spiritual rebirth. It's,
Yeah.
and you're certainly not alone in that regard. It certainly happened with me where I felt I'd turned my back on God, and you know, feeling quite privileged to have the ability to be reborn spiritually,
Yes.
and that's clearly what happened with yourself. And
Mm.
one last thing, Peter, I will let you get on with your day, sir. I was just wondering, it's a bit of a general question. Do you have a favourite sort of book, chapter, or quote in the Bible that you frequently go
Yes.
back to?
Yes, I do. It's I love this one. This is why I'm interrupting you. I can't wait to tell you.
It's fine.
I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me. To me, that sums up the entire gospel.
Yeah.
Christ lives in me, because of the fact that when it says I no longer live, it means my sinful nature has been crucified with Christ and has been replaced with his spirit within me, which doesn't mean, of course, that you still don't do things you wish you didn't, but the indwelling power is the one that is always there for us, the unconditional love that guides us, leads us, and takes us beyond our capabilities very often, spiritual capabilities, certainly.
Absolutely. I think it can open up so many doors for you, and clearly it did that for you in the sort of research and writing of your book. I think I will leave you there, sir. I will just touch upon your book, Thank God for Football, released in 2006, available in all good bookshops, followed up by the Illustrated Companion, which came out in 2010. I can heartily recommend both books. And of course, Thank God for Football is available in video TV form on YouTube, free of charge. So what better? You don't have to do anything. Just pop on there and give it a good watch. Peter, is there anything else you would like to add or mention at all before I?
Well, in connection with the book, it's also available on Amazon, and people can get, if they want, cheap second-hand copies from Amazon to save them having to spend the full whack. Also from the publisher, SPCK, it can be got from there too. I will just add how much I enjoy your night prayer YouTube talks, Graham, and I would recommend people to watch them. I think they're very, very uplifting, delivered in a very warm and personal way, as if you're talking to one person rather than a massive audience. And you make me feel quite rested when I've watched them. So thank you for that.
Oh no, that's incredibly kind of you to say. It's, how can I put it? I feel the urge to share the good news, and hopefully, if other people like me will experience the sort of transformative power of faith, and that's why I do it. But Peter, thank you ever so much for talking to me. It's been absolutely fascinating, and it's been a real honour to actually get the chance to talk to you as well. So thank you ever so much.
You're very welcome. It's been a privilege to speak to you, Graham. Thank you.
Thank you.